Okay, so topic 5, World War One. In the 1920s, we're going to conclude our conversation of these events today. Look for these terms as we go and make sure that you can do these things. Excuse me. We're going to start with prohibition, the banning of alcohol use. Since the early 1800s, temperance reformers had crusaded against alcohol. Temperance was a cause held dear by many progressives. By 1917, some 75% of Americans lived in dry counties that had banned liquor. World War I increased support for temperance. It seemed unpatriotic to use corn, wheat, and barley to make alcohol when soldiers overseas needed bread. But of course, that begins to change. Let's see. Francis Willard is an example of a leader of the temperance movement. Bottom left there, though, that's Al Capone, who's going to make a lot of money off of prohibition, right? Smuggling alcohol, bootlegging, that sort of thing. The 18th Amendment will be enforced from 1920 through 1933. The impact of prohibition. So summarize the effects of the impact of prohibition on American society. Now let's switch to cars. The automobile reshaped American culture, creating new forms of recreation and making it easier for people to travel. Think about that map that I showed you of roadways and the picture of Henry Ford in the last video notes section. Other factors also contributed to changing ways of daily life. Americans listened to the radio, went to the movies, and followed the exploits of sports heroes. In the process, a new mass culture emerged, one whose shape and character closely resembles our own today. How did people live? Changes here. Sports stars, right? You have Hollywood stars. This is the golden age of sports. There's Babe Ruth. Some firsts for American women. Let's look at this chart. Florence Allen, the first woman state judge in 1920, all the way down to Phoebe Olmley, the first woman to earn a federal pilot's license in 1927. So think about how women broke new social, economic, and political barriers in the 1920s. Literature and the arts. This should be pretty quick to go through, but interesting, I hope. Modernist painters are going to be active during this time period, expressing their concerns about sort of where things are headed. Some novelists and the themes that they focused on. F. Scott Fitzgerald, notice the Jazz Age. We'll be talking about that in our next conversation. And again, I want to re-reference the Great Migration. With the Great Migration, you see the movement of African Americans out of the South, and so their culture is going with them to the North, places like Chicago and Harlem, New York. We'll be talking about the Harlem Renaissance and an activity momentarily. African American politics are also important. The Crisis is a magazine, and in the magazine in May of 1919, it's printed this quote: "We return from fighting, we return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America or know the reason why." So African American veterans return home more determined than ever to effect change. The Great Migration means that many African Americans are living in northern urban areas, and they become a powerful voting bloc in those areas. The first African American congressman from Chicago is a man named Oscar DePriest. The NAACP will also be working to promote the issue of lynching and block the nominations of racists to the Supreme Court. Marcus Garvey will also be active during this time period. He will begin to promote something called Negro nationalism, which is a Harlem-based movement inspired by Booker T. Washington and his calls for self-reliance. He questioned whether African Americans would ever truly find freedom in a white-controlled society. He will end up being convicted of mail fraud and ultimately deported to Jamaica in 1927. He's a controversial figure. Thought we would learn more about him.
Marcus Garvey wanted to return African Americans to Africa to create a vibrant Black nation, empowered through economic independence. Although some of his goals were controversial, his crusade would inspire leaders from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela.
Garvey was certainly a controversial figure, but the concepts that we now think of as Black nationalism and Black pride started with Garvey's pronouncements.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, on August 17, 1887. Beginning as a printer's apprentice at 14, Garvey became a union organizer and later worked various jobs across Central America.
Marcus Garvey found wherever he went, Black people of African heritage in particular were always on the lower stratification end of society. This had a profound impact on him. Particularly, his concern was for the uplift of African people globally.
In 1912, Garvey sailed to London, England, and took night courses at Birkbeck College. After working for a Pan-African newspaper, Garvey returned to Jamaica in 1914 and formed the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA.
The UNIA was about Black self-determination. It was about galvanizing the ideas of Black repatriation to the motherland, the continent of Africa. And it was extremely important in terms of getting Black people to understand self-pride, pride in one's race.
Inspired by Booker T. Washington to raise funds and start his own school, Garvey came to the United States in 1916 and in 1918 began publishing the Negro World newspaper.
Garvey was extremely outspoken. He was, some people would say, almost bombastic. He wanted to take over Africa and had elected himself as president of Africa without consulting the Africans, unfortunately.
Determined to achieve economic independence for African Americans, Garvey launched the Negroes Factories Association in 1919 and a shipping company called the Black Star Line, which he planned to use to transport passengers back to Africa.
Garvey was a great organizer, but unfortunately not a great businessman. During the time that Garvey and the UNIA were trying to launch the Black Star Line, they solicited funds from investors for stock options through the mail. And this resulted later on in allegations of mail fraud, and Garvey was convicted and sent to prison.
After serving 5 years in prison, Garvey was deported. He eventually moved to London, and in 1938, he supported the Greater Liberia Act, created by known white supremacist Senator Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi.
Marcus Garvey's association with Senator Bilbo is related more on a practical level rather than an intellectual like for each other. Marcus Garvey's attempt to help Africans in America leave and go to Africa fell in line with some aspects of KKK philosophy.
Garvey died in London on June 10, 1940. He was reinterred in Jamaica in 1964 and is hailed as Jamaica's first national hero and the prophet of the Rastafarian religion.
Although Garvey was a flawed leader, he's someone who is really important to the history of the Black radical tradition. He was probably one of the strongest voices of Black nationalism in history.
The Jazz Age, the 1920s. It's going to be F. Scott Fitzgerald who coins this term, but jazz refers to an African American musical contribution. It's the first truly American musical form based on improvisation. And you can see in this chart sort of where it's coming from. You've probably heard of Dixie jazz before, fusion jazz before, all of the sort of offshoots of it like ragtime and blues. Jazz and blues were expressions of the African American experience. The pain of the African American experience can be heard in the blues, and the joy of that experience in the soaring notes of jazz. We are going to talk more about jazz music and the broader conversation of the Harlem Renaissance in an activity that we have coming up in a little bit. But between now and then, reach